I was born 37 years ago in the cold lands of Minnesota. I am not immortal, and I am not alone. Now is the time of the reviewing, when the stroke of a sword will release the power of the rambling. In the end, there can be only one. Upload at a time.
Here we are, born to be kings. We're the princes of the
Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. This is a Point Gallery Highlander Katana. It's the Duncan MacLeod iteration from the Highlander TV show. This one is from the Season 1, or at least that's what it's supposed to be, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Before I get into the review, things I often disclose early on. One, I got this sword secondhand, so it may not be representative of what you would expect to see if you were to buy one from Point Gallery today. It's also on the older side, so maybe they've improved or maybe they haven't. I'm not exactly sure, but know that it's older and it's secondhand. I did pay my own money for it. That's something else people want to know. I spent my own hard-earned ducats on it, even though I did get it secondhand, so I didn't buy it directly from Point Gallery is the point there. Also, no, I am not an expert in Highlander, swordsmanship, martial arts, or katanas. I'm an enthusiast, but I am passionate about all of them. I've seen the Highlander TV show. I am a fan, and I obviously own this here sword. So I'm going to tell you about it. Hopefully you enjoy. So the next bit is what makes Point Gallery special. Why Point Gallery? You can throw a rock if you're looking for a sword anyway, and hit 12 different Highlander katanas. They're a very common product that's out there, and Point Gallery is somebody that's noted for making a very durable, reputable reproduction of the sword if you actually have one that you want to use it on. Now, when you buy a Highlander katana at the mall, say, or online, very often they are not functional. They're stainless steel, sword-like objects that aren't really made to be used, and if they are made to be used, they're often not including the best steels or things like that, and Point Gallery doesn't necessarily do that either. The main point of Point Gallery is that the handle furniture is very durable. It's supposed to be very durable anyway and functional, but they will attach it to whatever katana you want. They don't make the swords or the blades, they attach them to other things, and they run the gambit in terms of price. This one would probably cost $1,200 or $1,500. I'm not exactly sure, honestly, how much it would cost, maybe less. But the point is that it depends on the input that you're putting in. I've seen them attached to really fancy Rick Barrett katanas, and obviously that's going to cost a lot more money than if you attach it to a $50 sword from Musashi. Point Gallery really is responsible for this component of it, the Tsuba, and then the handle itself and attaching it to a sword. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but just know that they're supposed to be quite functional. Very often the tang doesn't extend very far, the dragon heads pop off, and they're not known for being the most durable of swords. But if you, like me, were influenced by the TV show and you always thought it was cool as hell, and you want a sword that you can swing around too, then Point Gallery is a good option for a functional and durable thing that you can whack into stuff. As a side note, I will include links in the description down below that direct you to where you can find stuff from Point Gallery if you want to contact them and ask them how much it would cost to make one. This sword is the Season 1 Highlander TV series version sword, and that I guess they changed around a little bit from season to season, and this one is supposed to be from Season 1. The blade is a Kris Cutlery blade manufactured many years ago. It was one of the first katana that they made, from my understanding. Point Gallery calls this the Musashi Katana, though it's not made by Musashi, and I don't know if their other wares were. This is crafted by Sal de Aquila. I'm probably saying the man's name wrong, which I feel bad about. I believe he passed away some time ago, and actually had some hand in the creation of props for the original TV series, but I honestly don't know the truth of that story or really much about it, though supposedly had some hand in the crafting of props for the TV series, which I suppose adds a little bit of flavor to the story of having the man that made them for the TV series, or at least had some hand in making them for the TV series, have a part in making you one. Mentally, that makes a departure from a replica of what the show made the sword out to be and a replica of the prop that was actually used in the show, which is, I don't know, has a little zazz to it in my mind. Now, the little bit of story I can tell you about this sword is honestly fake and from the Highlander TV show or lore from the show, which I don't really think has much of a place in history, but there's a few points worth noting. One, there are two different Highlander characters, Duncan and Connor, if you're not familiar. Hopefully you are. They're not the same person. They're different characters in the universe, if you will. And the Duncan Katana is a little different than the Connor Katana. They both have similar looking swords with ivory hilts on them, but they are nonetheless different characters with different swords and swords that have different stories. The story goes that Duncan was shipwrecked in Japan in the 18th century. He met a samurai that taught him some stuff, and that was important to being cool and being the Highlander and all sorts of other good things. Anyway, that guy committed ritual suicide because reasons, and Duncan got the sword. Now, stated in the show, or maybe just something I read on the internet, it was supposed to be made by Masahiro, and I guess he's really good at making swords, and also this sword is apparently good at breaking other swords. Now, I believe in the show, this hilt is supposed to, or the handle is supposed to be made out of ivory, presumably, or bone, or something like that. And from a historical perspective, there were actually katana that were mounted up with bone or ivory. They're very uncommon. It's not a normal thing to have done. And most of the examples I could find in my research seem to come from the Meiji period, which is sometime in the mid-19th century into the early 20th century. And this sword was supposed to be made in the 16th century, so it's or Duncan's sword was supposed to be made in the 16th century. So the point is that it's a little bit early, but there are some historic examples. From what I could find on the show, actually, the original Connor sword, the one that first appeared in the Highlander movie that got the franchise going, was based on a sword from Marto called the Ivory Katana, but I can't necessarily find that. I do see an example of something that it might be, and that sword was likely inspired by other things made of ivory. In any case, it does have some maybe quasi-root in history, though it's not a common thing. Very rarely would a sword be mounted in ivory, and probably with good reason. Now, samurai back in the day wouldn't necessarily mind showing their wealth or a little bit of bling. You would see saya wrapped in samegawa, and there would be elaborate presentation things that would stand out, and ivory would certainly be one of those things that would stand out. And so the point is that it's not impossible that you might see a samurai with an ivory handled or an ivory mounted sword, but it would be extremely rare, and on top of that, probably not made for combat as much as ceremony. At least that would be my guess, because I don't think that they would necessarily hold up as durably as a traditionally mounted sword, though what do I know? Now, when I say that historically ivory handles weren't that durable, that's because, not to say ivory isn't durable. I mean, it's on elephants and they can lift each other up and stab each other with those tusks, so it's obviously got some sort of durability to it. But the point is that if you put it on a sword in small, kind of rigid pieces, it's gonna be susceptible to cracking. And if I assume that this is one solid ivory handle, well, it doesn't necessarily work as well as the more traditional Japanese handle. Now, on the top of these, you have a metal collar on the top and a metal collar on the bottom, and underneath, this is made out of wood panels. The tang of the blade goes in here, and the two panels are joined. Now, also note that this substance underneath here, this samegawa, or this ray skin, is basically wrapped all the way around the handle. This is an example of a good handle, wherein we have wooden panels circled by samegawa, this kind of leathery substance, and then bound in ito. This stuff here, this is an example of a less expensive sword. Samegawa is pretty durable stuff, even though this is a really cheap skin. If I try to rip it, it's not coming apart. So the substance is pretty durable, and in this case it's wrapped all the way around the handle in one large sheet, and well, that's part of what holds it together. Then it's bound together by this cord, so as the tang inside here is bouncing around, whacking into things, there's a lot of things working together to make this a very durable, hardened handle so that it can take shock and not break apart in battle. I'm not necessarily convinced that an ivory handle would do the same thing, and that's probably one of the many reasons, other than I don't think there's a lot of elephants in Japan, that you don't see things like this, or bone handles or other things like this in historical swords. Anyway, now we're going to move on to the actual review portion, and I'm gonna just basically talk about this. Now, normally I would have separate components that I could dissect, if you will, and I could talk about them individually, and in this case I really can't, because it's all one lump of plastic. Well, it's not exactly plastic. It's supposedly made of carbon fiber and high-strength resin, though I haven't broken it in half, and honestly, I don't exactly know how I would tell if it is or isn't. In any case, Point Gallery notes that there are some strength tests that take place, and I suppose the reputation is likely earned because this is known as one of the more durable Highlander katanas out there, one where you're not going to deal with it breaking in half and such. Though, note that they did break on the movie. There's a famous blooper from the original Highlander movie. Obviously, it's not this sword, but a prop that is similar, where at the end, the little dragon head pops off and kind of sputters away a little bit during the final climax, the crescendo of the movie. It should also be noted that the tang is affixed to the handle in such a way that it will not come off. It can't be disassembled for maintenance, and I believe most of them are constructed this way, if not all of them. I could be wrong. I don't know the various options that are available from Point Gallery, though do note that there's a very strong likelihood that by default it's going to be attached to the handle permanently and not able to be disassembled. Not being able to disassemble the sword is a problem for a few different reasons, and the first one that comes to mind for me really is that I need to keep in context that this is a sword that's built to be used. It's renowned as being one of the most durable options you can use if you want a Highlander sword that you can actually swing at things, and if that's the case, then you probably want to disassemble it. Baked into the cake of Japanese swords is some need for maintenance, some need to maybe shim around a little bit, tighten up a tsuba, things like that. There are very hard metals and soft metals integrated in the same handle, and it's common that a rattle might develop, and if you can't take it apart, well, that could create some problems. Now, it probably goes without saying, but this is one of the most recognizable swords from TV and film. I really enjoyed it when I was a kid, and I'm sure many of the people watching this video probably enjoyed it when they were kids or adults, or maybe they enjoy it now. But one thing I didn't know, and that I found in the process of doing a little bit of poking on the internet for this, is the story behind the panels on this sword. You often see that it has some ornate decorations, but you don't really get a chance to look at it very thoroughly in the show, and you've probably seen many replicas online, and so there's obviously a very ornate story being told, and I didn't really know what it was until now, and I can share that with you. The first panel is a kabuki performance, or somebody depicting a supernatural character narrating a story. I don't necessarily see the supernatural character narrating a story, but I do see what looks like a mask, and supposedly it's supposed to be a kabuki performance depicting, as I mentioned, a supernatural character narrating a story. The second is a tea ceremony, symbolizing nobility and the path to enlightenment, or so I read on the internet. It's tough for me to see. I see people drinking, but I don't necessarily know what a tea ceremony looks like. Nevertheless, that's what that is supposed to be. The next depiction is a pilgrimage to a Shinto shrine, where a practitioner is cleansing his hands before entering, symbolizing purity, or the need to have clean hands. I'm not exactly sure. Again, many of these things I don't necessarily see, and that's why I would have never guessed what was really going on in the depictions. But supposedly, this one is a pilgrimage to a shrine wherein the practitioner cleansing his hands to symbolize purity. Followed by that, we have a group of people fishing, symbolizing happiness and freedom. Personally, I like fishing, and it is quite freeing and happying. Then we have a dragon representing yang energy and good fortune, and then a tiger representing yin energy and courage and patience. There's also the dragon head at the end of the katana, which I don't know is just there because it's really badass, at least presumably. There are some additional artistic embellishments that separate the panels. They almost look like Japanese sword furniture in a way. There's something that looks like a fuchi towards the top, though it's not really a fuchi. There are some separated pieces as well. And from what I could see in historic pieces made out of ivory, there wasn't necessarily one solid piece of ivory, so they would have kind of spacers or something to separate them. Anyway, I thought it would be fun to share that. I always wondered what those panels actually meant. I never really looked at them too much. I would see the pictures and I didn't necessarily understand what they were intended to mean. So understanding a little bit more and how it ties into the Highlander story, I suppose, is, I don't know, adds another layer of depth to my fandom. Now I have to harp on some quality aspects here, and that is that there's a downside here, and that is that the carvings are not necessarily very clear. And maybe that's because it's supposed to be worn from centuries of usage or something like that, and maybe it's intentionally made that way, but in effect it's really difficult to make out all of the detail on the panels. And again, perhaps it's supposed to be that way from a prop perspective or from the Duncan mythos because it's been used so much over the centuries. Anyway, crisp details are nice if I'm looking at it as a wall aspect, because I can make out those details more, and oftentimes these ivory handled pieces from a historic perspective, or at least the examples that I could find online, were very ornate and very detailed and not necessarily muddied down as this was, though presumably they were not used by a Highlander for centuries either. The place where the kind of muddied features are a boon is in how it doesn't tear up your hands. I have another example of a Highlander katana, the Connor sword, made by a different company called Zeist Armories, and it's made of a different material, but the main thing to note here is that the scenes are very similar between the two, and the main point I want to draw on here is that the Highlander katana from Zeist Armory is much crisper and cleaner in terms of the presentation of these depictions. The downside is it is murder on your hand to move that sword around. It chews into your hands as you're swinging it, and it is wildly uncomfortable to move around. Not that this sword is comfortable either. However, one thing I noted when holding these very crisp, clear depictions is that they all bite into my hand as I swing it around, and it's like kind of trying to grip onto sandpaper. Not particularly fun. The Duncan sword from Point Gallery and the examples that I've been able to find from Point Gallery all seem to have a little bit more muddied features. I don't know if that's because the mold they're using has been used so much that the features are just dulled, or if it's intentional. It should also be noted along the seam or on either side, they really kind of are a little off. They don't necessarily meet, and there's some attempt to kind of join sides and make it even, but you can kind of tell that they don't line up, and it's not as crisp and clean as it perhaps should be. It doesn't look like it's made from one solid piece of ivory. It looks like it was joined, and kind of you can see where the sculpting comes in. The other note is that the handle isn't perfectly centered. On one side it's about 1/8 of an inch off, I would say, and it does wander a little bit lengthwise. If I just look down from the dragon head, it kind of wanders off to one side, and I don't know if that's a remnant of being a Kris Cutlery katana or because it was used, but it's worth noting that it wanders a little bit. Now, as I mentioned, the other Highlander sword was uncomfortable because of the carvings. This sword was not uncomfortable because of the carvings are dulled, so it didn't chew into my hands. I didn't have any trouble gripping it, even when my hands were sweaty. Unfortunately, that dragon head is murder on the hands and really makes it uncomfortable. I don't believe the tang extends all the way down through the dragon head, so I was a little nervous to grab it and use it for a point of leverage because I didn't want it to break. I know that's a soft spot, or at least can be in the swords. So I was intentionally trying to keep my left hand above the dragon head area. And the ledges on the dragon head just dug into my hands, and swinging the katana was wildly uncomfortable, particularly when I was cutting into mats.
That's done. That's painful, huh? No, it just, I'm gonna be if I keep going.
Now we'll talk about the Tsuba, or the cross guard, or the little circular disc thing. And in a nutshell, it depicts two roosters fighting in a circular pattern, and their feathers are flowing around. The Tsuba looks to be cast in bronze. From what I can find, that's the material that's used. And the detail is decent, but I wouldn't describe it as honestly great. Again, I don't know if this is supposed to depict something that's been worn over the centuries, and I don't exactly know what the symbolism is of the two roosters fighting, though. I can kind of see some symbolism between, two cocks battling it out, if you will. The point is, though, that the casting quality is really where I would harp on it. This is supposed to be a really expensive, nice sword with really competent people doing the casting and work on it, and the depictions here just aren't as crisp and clear as some products that I would see from Hanwei or other people that are known for doing a good job at recasting things. Again, maybe it's intentional. If it isn't, then it's a problem. If it is, then I don't necessarily know why. But again, it could be due to age, and it could be that it's a replica of the actual prop, and that's what was used in the show. So why bitch? Anyway, that's what I'm bitching about. The saya and the blade are both from Kris Cutlery. The saya is a simple wood. It's not necessarily specific to the show. It doesn't have a kurigata. It's not the best saya. And the blade, I believe, is made out of 5160, done through a stock removal process, for at least based on what I can see. Now, the thing I'll note about this particular blade and the Kris Cutlery one is I've had actually a couple of them from the past, and they're an old original iteration of some of the katanas Kris Cutlery was making like 20 years ago, but they're very durable. They're very thick. They're a little bit overbuilt, but you can certainly whack them into stupid things and they will continue living. I can tell you that from experience. I've done some stupid things with that Kris Cutlery sword. Not this one, but one of its brothers, if you will. Anyway, I'll include links and additional descriptions and specs of this sword in the description down below. Now, moving the sword around is, it's heavy and it chews in your hands. It's not something that's fun to do kata with. It's not something I would advise, though you're probably not looking at this sword from a practitioner standpoint. Just know you can use it. It's not fun. It makes people at your dojo laugh at you. They did it at me, but damn it, I thought it was cool. Anyway, you can see the sword moving around, and I've included the weapon dynamics computer if you're interested. You can see it's among the heavier, more cumbersome, clunky swords, but nevertheless, there you go. In terms of cutting, this sword is not necessarily super sharp, nor is it really aiding me in my cutting. I am, as I mentioned earlier, not an expert, and this sword is not doing me any favors. I really have to put a lot of chutzpah on the blade to get it to go through a tatami mat. And I know I am cutting used tatami mats that are known to be a little bit harder, and this is where I just feel the sword dig into my hands, and it's not terribly comfortable. I actually stop pretty quickly because I'm nervous that I'm going to rip the skin off my hands. So it's not something I would advocate using, but you can obviously use it. It certainly cuts, and I cut a pretty hard target with it. Used tatami is known to be a little bit more stern or hard on swords, and it cut it just fine. Just required a lot of oomph. I also didn't notice any damage to the sword from using it. It's not any more wiggly than it was before. Kris Cutlery was not the most precise in their execution on the blade, but I don't notice any additional defects, so it's obviously a durable sword, and I didn't notice any rattling or any other issues in the handle. It's still put together rock solid the way it was, even though I did some bad cuts into tatami and just kind of stopped midway through. That's a lot of shock for the sword to absorb, and I don't notice any problems with the sword to this point. One additional note about this sword in particular, something that gives it a little bit of sentimental value to me, is that Adrian Paul actually held this while he was putting on the sword experience in Minneapolis. In 2018, Adrian Paul came to Minneapolis to put on a sword experience. That's where he shows you some movie choreography and teaches you a little bit of how to move a sword around from the cinematic perspective. And while he was here, he gave out autographs and things like that. I brought the sword up to him and asked him to sign it Randy Jackson. I don't know if he knew that was a joke from Step Brothers or not, or maybe it's not the first time anybody's asked him to do it.
See that black smudge right there on the blade?
Yeah?
Look at it closely. Pretty recognizable signature.
No.
Randy Jackson from American Idol.
Why do you have Randy Jackson's autograph on a martial arts weapon?
Because I bumped into him and all I had on me was this samurai sword, and you're not gonna not get Randy Jackson's autograph, right?
I would have done the exact same
He
thing.
didn't really do that, though. I actually had him sign the certificate of authenticity for this sword, so both Sal's signature as well as Adrian Paul's signature are on the certificate of authenticity, which I thought was cool. He also took a picture of the sword where the edge is pointed precariously close to my neck. I don't know if he knew it was a shinken or a live blade, if you will, or not, but it was still fun, and he said it felt a little different than some of the other swords that, I mean, obviously there are a lot of people there with a lot of Highlander swords, but I didn't spot anyone else with the point gallery version, so it obviously probably felt heavier and more killy than perhaps some of the other things. Anyway, I thought that what made it special, or at least sentimentally special to me, and maybe it's a fun story for you. Anyway, if you have the chance to go to a sword experience or meet Adrian Paul, be sure you bring the sword up to him and ask him to sign it Randy Jackson. Now's the part of the review where I answer the question, do I personally think that this sword is worth it? And to most people, probably not, honestly. If you're looking for a sword-like object or a collectible that just looks like a decoration, something that you don't really intend on swinging or using, no, there are much less expensive alternatives that look like the Highlander sword that will look great on your wall. However, if you're somebody that values, well, being able to choose what sword, you have a favorite brand or a type, or you want something special, you can choose what sword goes into the handle, which is really Point Gallery's contribution. Subsequently, if you want a handle that's about as durable as the construction can be given this style of handle, then yes, this is also going to help. You are left with a durable sword that you can whack into things, and if you want something that is both akin to the prop used in the show and also functional to be whacked into things, this is about as good as it gets, and for those specific people, this is a really compelling option. Now, I'm considering this roughly a $1,200 to $1,500 sword, and for that amount of money, I think that this is a good thing if you are that customer, if you value the type of sword that goes in the blade and you want it to be functional. And you also want to whack stuff with it so that you need a durable handle so that the head doesn't pop apart or that it doesn't turn into a helicopter of death flying across the room. The important question to ask yourself is, what type of customer are you? Are you somebody that needs or wants a functional Highlander sword? And if so, then maybe this is worth your extra dollar, though many people, I would argue, probably just want something that reminds them of the show and sits on their wall. And if you are somebody that wants the Highlander sword, temper your expectations, because you're likely going to be met with the same experience I am if you're using this thing. And that is that it's not a comfortable sword to use. It hurts your hands if you're swinging it at even medium objects like the tatami mats I was swinging it at. Subsequently, I have a lot more respect for Adrian Paul swinging this thing around for years on the Highlander TV show. It is quite a bear on the hands, and he's not always wearing gloves either. So anyway, that's all I've got for you. I hope that the review was helpful. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching.